Yes, we're breaking into programming to bring you an update in the corruption case of former Chicago Alderman Ed Burke. Burke has been sentenced to 2 years in prison and a $2 million fine for racketeering, bribery, and attempted extortion.
The U.S. District Judge Virginia Kendall handed down that sentence just moments ago after saying she wanted to deter Burke and others from committing further acts of corruption. That has been said before by other judges as well, we should note. Today, U.S. attorneys said they estimate the cost of Burke's crimes to come out to nearly $830,000. Prosecutors had asked for a 10-year prison sentence. Burke's own lawyers instead asking for probation or home confinement, noting that he recently turned 80 years old. Ed Burke served as 14th Ward Alderman for 54 years, ostensibly taking over that job from his deceased father. In December, a jury found the ex-alderman guilty of racketeering, bribery, and attempted extortion as the once powerful politician tried to use his position to win business for his property tax law firm.
Our own Taman Bradley was in the courtroom, and he will certainly have the latest for us on the WGN News at 4 p.m. For now, we're going to take a short break and get back to Spotlight Chicago.
Nearly 5 years after an FBI raid at City Hall sent shockwaves through Chicago's political scene, the corruption trial of former Alderman Ed Burke is set to begin on Monday.
In tonight's cover story, WGN political reporter Taman Bradley goes inside the once powerful public servant's rise and fall that spanned 5 decades.
Last April at City Council, the end of an era. One of the last of the old-school Chicago machine politicians, Alderman Ed Burke, bid farewell.
Many of you have, over the years, heard me quote the great Anglo-Irish statesman Edmund Burke, who wrote, "In politics, there are no permanent enemies, no permanent friends, only permanent interests."
The fedora, pinstripe suits, driver, and bodyguards, Ed Burke looked the part, power personified. He may be retired, but the story of Ed Burke's extraordinary 54-year reign is still unfolding. The final chapter of his legacy will be written by the results of his federal corruption case.
One of the problems as people gain power is they tend to misuse it. And usually the longer they stay in office, the more they abuse it.
He was one of a kind in terms of the way this city operates. And sadly, he was also not that unusual in terms of his willingness to be corrupted by the system that he helped create.
Burke's rise began in the 1960s. After a stint as a Chicago police officer, Burke followed in his father's footsteps, taking over his 14th Ward aldermanic seat. In the 80s, Burke captured control of the powerful Finance Committee.
At that point, he had already been a long-serving member of council, and he had formed an alliance with Eddie Verdoliak, who was the most powerful person in council. And Verdoliak was not the sort of person who's going to dig into the nitty-gritty, whereas Ed Burke was.
Well, he's a lawyer, so he understands the law. He understands history. He understands the rules of order. But the most important is there are less than 10 members of the city council at any given time who understand the finances, the city budget, and how the city works.
Well, here's Harold! Following the election of Harold Washington as Chicago's first black mayor, Alderman Ed Verdoliak and Burke banded together to challenge Washington at every turn. The men led a group of 29 aldermen in the years-long battle known as the Council Wars.
Harold would introduce something. Burke and his allies would oppose it.
All of a sudden, out of nowhere, declaring that the City Council of Chicago is a legislative body and playing to the racial divisions that had been part of that mayoral race. They were wearing white buttons on their lapels, the Verdoliak 29. It was very crude symbolism and very directly appealing to racial bias. And it's a blot on his career that he never has been able to completely erase.
At Finance, Burke controlled the city's $100 million workers' comp program, where he and political allies made decisions about disability checks for injured workers. Critics say there was no meaningful oversight or transparency.
Instead of using the executive branch or just an insurance company to handle that question, They had it handled by the Finance Committee.
For decades, Burke dodged federal investigations that threatened to weaken him, including a ghost payrolling scheme. Dozens were charged, but not Burke. Council colleagues marveled at Burke's encyclopedic knowledge of Chicago history, constituent services, and legislative insight. His immense skills and willingness to evolve allowed him to keep his job, despite a demographic shift in his ward to majority Hispanic. It's a story reminiscent of embattled former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan.
As with Mike Madigan, where there was in the back of people's minds a concern that there might be something illegal happening behind the curtain, he also had such capability in terms of the actual job performance that in some instances I think people were willing to suspend suspicion in order to say, well, Ed Burke can get it done.
November 2018, the beginning of the end. Federal agents raided Burke's City Hall office. Months later, Burke is indicted on 14 counts. Among the allegations, demanding a Burger King franchise owner use his law firm for tax work in exchange for help with city permits, offering to grease the wheels for the redevelopment of the old post office if the developer retained his firm, and threatening to derail a proposed museum admission fee hike because the museum wouldn't give a friend's child an internship. Burke denies the allegations.
I'm not guilty of anything. I haven't done anything wrong, and I'm sure that once it gets to court, it'll be clear.
Prosecutors say the criminal activity was caught on tape. For 2 years, former Alderman Danny Solis wore a wire secretly recording conversations with Burke. The court is expected to hear the tapes.
There's a difference between reading the transcript and hearing the tapes. And I know from covering other trials that when you hear the audio, you really hear how real it is. And there are inflections of voice that really bring to the surface the greed, the transactional nature of these relationships, the leverage that is being applied.
The charges didn't stop 14th Ward voters from giving Burke a 13th term in 2019. His council exit came on his own terms 4 years later when he decided not to run again. No permanent enemies, no permanent friends, only permanent interests.
If I have failed during these past 54 years in achieving that goal, please permit me to apologize.
Now a new goal for the former Dean of City Council, avoid prison time. Tamon Bradley, WGN
alderman will be heading to prison within a few days.
Ed Burke must report to federal prison by next Monday, but could begin serving his corruption sentence even earlier.
Dane Placco has new information about where Burke may be serving his 2-year sentence.
Initially, when Burke was sentenced last June, his attorneys asked that he be sent to the minimum federal security prison in Oxford, Wisconsin, where many Chicago politicians have served after being caught. But apparently that facility is now full. So it's likely that Burke will be headed to Indiana.
This is a terrible legacy to leave. He will be remembered as the longest serving alderman, but also as corrupt.
Former Chicago alderman and retired political science professor Dick Simpson says it's a saga as old as Chicago itself. In June, Ed Burke was sentenced to 2 years in prison and a $2 million fine after being convicted on 13 counts of racketeering, extortion, and bribery. It's a bitter humiliation for the 80-year-old Burke, who served more than 50 years on the Chicago City Council, representing the 14th Ward on the southwest side.
I've got a few comments.
In early August, Burke's attorneys filed a motion saying that while Burke initially requested to serve his sentence at a satellite camp at the minimum security federal prison in Oxford, Wisconsin, that facility is now closed. Now, Burke is asking to serve his time at the minimum security prison camp in Terre Haute, Indiana. The federal judge in his case agreed to make that recommendation. It was built in 1960 to house nonviolent felons and includes 2 8- and 12-person rooms. GED and drug education classes are available, as are opportunities for sports, cards, golf, and crafts, according to its Wikipedia page. And it's where former Illinois Governor George Ryan spent time before being released in 2013.
We've unfortunately just sort of gotten used to corruption. It happens so much in Chicago that it's almost as if it's expected.
Dr. Connie Mixon is a political science professor at Elmhurst University who testified as an expert on public corruption at Burke's trial. Burke was convicted of trying to steer tax appeal work to his private law firm by shaking down developers and business owners. Much of it captured on secret recordings made by former alderman Danny Solis.
While you're at it, recommend the good firm of Crafter & Burke to do the tax work.
It is this persistent culture of corruption that stems largely from our legacy of machine politics. And Burke is one of the last of the old school machine politicians in Chicago.
But Mixon and others say it would be foolish to believe that Burke going to prison will be enough to change the culture of corruption, even as the traditional machine loses its grip on power.
The machine has been transformed, particularly under Richard M. Daley and Rahm Emanuel. It still exists in some wards. It's much diminished in its power.
Burke got plenty of support during his sentencing, 200 letters from supporters talking about his good deeds, but that wasn't enough to keep him out of prison, which Burke will be reporting to no later than 2 p.m. next Monday. Dane Placco,
Secret
Fox
recordings
32
were
Chicago.
played in the Ed Burke corruption trial today. Tapes that prosecutors claim prove Burke wanted tax business in exchange for permits to renovate a Burger King. That Burger King on South Pulaski is at the center of the federal case against Burke. Prosecutors maintain that when the owners wanted permits to renovate that restaurant, Burke suggested the approval depended on them hiring his law firm to handle the real estate taxes. Jurors then heard this phone conversation secretly recorded back in 2017.
And we were going to talk about the real estate tax representation, and you're going to have somebody get in touch with me so we can expedite your permits.
I'm sorry, Mr. Burke. What was that last part?
You're going to have somebody call me so we can help you make sure you get your permits for the remodeling.
Now, Burke's attorneys countered that the law firm was never actually hired and that it was only a small part of a much larger conversation. Burke has pleaded not guilty to all the charges against him. Tomorrow will be day 12 of that corruption trial.
Judy, if Ed Burke was elected again and again and again on the trust of voters, tonight federal prosecutors say he betrayed that trust, and a jury has now agreed. Tonight, though, the question is what's next for Burke and what's next for the political figure on deck, former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan, who is set to go on trial with authorities using the same undercover mole that got Burke. When Ed Burke was the flashy head of Chicago's powerful City Council Finance Committee, nearly everyone called him Mr. Chairman. For decades, Burke solely determined the fate of people and programs. Tonight, his personal fate has been sealed by a dozen strangers who all agreed that Mr. Chairman was corrupt.
After the number of people that are convicted, the number of governors, the number of aldermen, the number of state representatives, the number of state senators, that people would get the message. I don't know if it's an endemic part of Chicago culture where people don't get that message, but they're not.
The most powerful evidence against Burke were these videos, 100 of them covertly recorded by secret FBI operative and former alderman Danny Solis.
Give Danny a call because I think he's going to be a main player in this whole process.
Solis's primary target, longtime Illinois Speaker of the House and Democratic power master Michael Madigan.
Tonight is not a good night for Speaker Madigan.
Mike Madigan is scheduled for Chicago trial in April. With Burke's fall tonight, Madigan knows that a jury fully believed undercover mole Danny Solis and trusted what they heard on his tapes.
There are many parallels between Burke and Madigan. The primary one is the power. Michael Madigan is probably the most powerful House Speaker in Illinois, if not in the nation, during his time. He was greatly feared, and he had been under the federal microscope. He had been the subject of many failed investigations for many years.
Alderman Burke is a very powerful alderman for years and years, decades. But he really doesn't hold a candle to the level of power that Mike Madigan had. And so I think 2024 is going to be a very, very interesting year.
Burke is just the latest Chicago alderman to betray the trust of voters. Bribes, graft, and kickbacks have turned the Chicago City Council into a gravy train for 36 aldermen since the 1970s. Then there are county and state officials whose membership in the Hall of Shame make Illinois a nearly unrivaled champion of corrupt activities. When Mr. Burke celebrates his 80th birthday a week from tomorrow, he will no doubt be wondering whether his 81st will also be spent.
Evidence against Alderman Burke was picked up over a wiretap. It involved renovations at a fast food restaurant. CBS 2's Vince Girasoli is always investigating. He breaks down the series of events and the criminal complaint that led to the charges.
The Burger King on 41st and Pulaski is never mentioned by name, but its permit history matches events outlined in the federal criminal complaint against Alderman Ed Burke. Property records link ownership to Shukat Donani and the Donani Group of Sugar Land, Texas, which operates hundreds of fast food franchises nationwide. The complaint outlines the following timeline. It includes early 2017, when restaurant executives seek permits for an exterior and driveway renovation. May 2017, restaurant architects inform owners they need a signed acknowledgement letter from the alderman and that Burke wanted to meet in person to discuss parking. Then, by May 23, 2017, the feds receive approval for a wiretap of Burke's cellular, referred to as the target phone. On June 8th, on the target phone, Burke asks an aide to find out what private law firm handled real estate tax work for the restaurant. On June 11th, on the target phone again, Burke says of the restaurant owner, "I'd also like to get some of his law business and get him involved here." At a June 14th Chicago lunch, Burke corruptly solicits tax work from company executives, according to the complaint, who contacted authorities. On June 27th, Burke uses his target phone to call a company executive saying, "We're going to talk about the real estate tax representation." The following months include recorded hardball references, permit denials, and work stoppages. By December of 2017, executives agree to give Burke tax business to avoid any further delays. Here's something else we learned from the complaint. Apparently, conversations with Burke's law firm went on for several months. The restaurant company received its permits. They completed their renovations, but in the end, they didn't give Burke and his law firm any of their business. Reporting live in the control room, I'm Vince Girasoli, CBS 2.